Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Westside Gunn record, And Then You Pray For Me. Westside Gunn is 100%, undoubtedly, unquestionably, undeniably mainstream in 2023. And if that's something that you told the average Westside Gunn fan, let's say a year ago, you would have been laughed at from here to another dimension and back. That just did not seem to be a thing that could possibly happen for this man. Sure, it's not like he was averaging 100 monthly listeners on Spotify or anything like that, but the guy also was not mainstream by any stretch of the term. Westside Gunn is just one of the most beloved underground rappers to come out of the century so far. And then a little thing happened. You might have heard of it. Utopia by Travis Scott, you know, the Sicko Mode guy. It's kind of a big deal. Kind of the biggest album of the year, unquestionably so far, and probably nothing will dethrone it in any way whatsoever. And there happened to be a Westside Gunn feature on that record, and here we are. As someone who is a Westside Gunn fan, I found myself really excited to see where he ended up going. I mean, it's not really been that long since Utopia dropped, and even less time since people really started to let the album sit with them and appreciate the Westside Gunn verse on that record even more. But at the same time, despite the infamous voice of the man and his odd delivery style, And Then You Pray For Me is his first real shot at being a commercial darling, much more than a critical darling. And also possibly his last shot, because this is meant to be his last proper studio release, but also he's not going to stop making music. Look, I'm not going to try and make sense of the man. Just do with that information what you will. This might be the last shot that he has, in a mainstream capacity at least, to make a huge splash. Add to the fact that And Then You Pray For Me is meant to be a sequel to his beloved 2020 record, Pray for Paris, a modern classic within experimental rap if there ever was one, and you have what is easily one of the most noteworthy releases in the genre as a whole for the entirety of 2023. It does bring me a lot of joy to say that And Then You Pray For Me may end up finding Westside Gunn a deeper fan base, deeper than any he's had before. But at the same time, it also acts as a horrible introduction to what makes him such a special performer in the first place. Past Westside albums, intentionally or not, have been structured around making things work when they really shouldn't. I mean, if you are even remotely familiar with the man in question, you know that the guy behind records like Fly God and Pray for Paris is a bit peculiar in terms of how he performs. It's also no secret that Westside's a polarizing figure, even within the communities that surround the more abstract styles of boom bap that he participates in. The guy's voice undeniably sounds like a door squeaking open and closed a lot, in my eyes, in a good way, and his flow is often used more for a tool of hypnosis than it is any traditional form of rhythm, and that's something that definitely puts off a lot of people, but it's also something that has completely defined an entirely unique sound and aesthetic brand for him. Nonetheless, all of these very strange qualities about Westside Gunn that make him, well, him, are things that have managed to just come together on previous releases. Even on albums where it feels like things shouldn't work, they just do, for the most part at least, outside of a couple of misses here and there throughout his catalog. However, And Then You Pray For Me is an entirely different story. This primarily relates to some of the stylistic changes and shifts found within this record. So, for clarification, for those sort of uninitiated, if you will, Westside Gunn's catalog up to this point has largely been structured around that aforementioned abstract take on classic boom bap sounds, resulting in an entirely modern, fresh, and extremely 2010s through 2020s style of instrumentation. However, while that is still present on And Then You Pray For Me, there is a good chunk of this record that is made up of just meat and potatoes, straightforward trap instrumentals. There's nothing wrong with shifting into a new sound. There are plenty of artists every year that do it well, but there's just something off about hearing these kind of particular trap instrumentals being put with Westside Gunn. Look, the same kind of beats that someone like 21 Savage would absolutely kill over are not the kind of instrumentals suited for a guy that comes from a completely different creative school of thought. And that's not necessarily to say that I want him to do the same thing over and over, but I just really feel like a lot of the new artistic directions being presented on And Then You Pray For Me just don't go with Westside's style whatsoever, and in the end they clash because of it, and it results in something that sounds clunky at best. Tracks like the Rick Ross collab Dunhill especially highlight the immediacy of these trap instrumentals mixed with the lack thereof within Westside Gunn's performance style. And again, neither of these things are bad. The instrumentals aren't great, but they tend to be fine, and Westside sounds the same as he ever has, love him or hate him. But they just don't adhere in any way, and again, it results in something that just feels like a clumsy misstep to appeal towards a more mainstream audience by introducing sounds that are already active within the mainstream culture. And Then You Pray For Me, from a creative standpoint, isn't a total disaster outside of a couple of lowlights here or there, like Disgusting, but at the same time, it feels like a poor representation of trap within a more underground and nuanced setting, and it especially feels like a terrible representation of what Westside Gunn is capable of. If anything, this record really just highlights how important it is that the man is performing over instrumentals that fit his style, because this is the first time that I can firmly say he is not. That isn't to say that the entire record is a full-on change of pace for Westside from a creative standpoint, and I do think that some people are over-exaggerating in terms of discourse in regards to how much he has changed here. That being said, the material here that does relate to a lot of his past works just feels average at best most of the time, with really only a couple of highlights standing out to give the album a slight bit of oomph. Not enough to save it from being mediocre, but still a little bit of oomph. I mean, the album opening cut, Mama's Prime Time, especially stands out and seems to be really promising at first being the album opening song, thanks to great verses from Jid as well as fellow Griselda member Conway the Machine. You have Jalen Rose with Boldy James, you have The Revenge of Flip's Leg with Rome Streets, amazing features that really stand out on this record. However, the common factor that you may have noticed there is the features, and the fact that I didn't mention Westside's verses at all in regards to those songs, all of which he does appear on with his own respective verses and lines. And that's because he is so heavily blown out of the water by artists here that feel much more capable in terms of lyrical style, in terms of delivery, and in terms of energy. That's not to say that Westside is a bad rapper or anything. I find him to be a great rapper. But being paired with someone who's as fast-spitting and lyrically structured as Jid, someone who's as high energy as someone like, say, Boldy James in terms of just pure heavy delivery and in pure density as a personality, it just doesn't really feel like any of them fit, but at the same time, all of them are good enough that they stand out, and Westside Gunn is the one that kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. And there are honestly a plethora of reasons why this occurs, why Westside is the weakest link on his own album, for the most part at least, outside of a couple weak features. But give me a minute, I'll touch on that later. Firstly, the musical inconsistency of the record itself forces Westside Gunn to be in a position where he comes across as a less interesting persona and figure. Despite how distinctive he is in terms of vocal cadence, among other things, it really doesn't feel like he changes at all on this record, and that's because he doesn't. The man has a stubborn delivery style, and he's being placed into a record that is ever evolving sonically, while he just stays the same. It makes him feel like a monotonous performer compared to a variety of features that are constantly changing due to the different natures of different performers and their own unique respective styles, thus allowing them to stand out way more than the man whose name is actually slapped on the record itself. And again, that doesn't mean that every single verse here is absolutely amazing. There are some weak verses, like, say, Ty Dolla $ign on Chloe, but even the weaker appearances on this record still feel fresh, because they are guest appearances from individuals that have styles wildly different from Westside, while Westside just does the same thing for the most part from track to track over a variety of different instrumentals, some of which suit him, some of which don't. And I don't mean to imply that every single featured artist on this record is better than Westside Gunn, or all of them outshine him in terms of lyrical ability and delivery and blah blah blah. All I'm trying to say is that on a record where a man refuses to change his actual style in terms of performance whatsoever, while the entire environment that he's in is constantly changing from track to track, it's kind of nice to hear things be broken up by other people because they have different styles that just feel way more unique. Again, a breath of fresh air from song to song. There's an argument to be made that the best verse on this entire record comes from Denzel Curry on the track Ultra Griselda, and the fact that I don't even really have to mention Westside's perfectly solid but accompanying other verse, I think that kind of sums up how this record plays out as a whole. That isn't to say that And Then You Pray For Me is miss after miss after miss either. In fact, I would say that it's fair to claim there's more just decent songs or fine songs on this record than there are genuinely bad songs. The weakest cuts on here include JD Wrist, Stephen Johnny, and 1989, and none of them are really horrible enough to single-handedly drag down the track list or anything like that. They're just notably weak spots on an album that's usually slightly better than that. And Then You Pray For Me's failure conceptually ultimately boils down to a lack of consistency. It constantly feels like this album is bouncing between perfectly predictable but still solid Westside Gunn tracks and some of the worst songs that he's cut in quite some time. Not rancid songs, but definitely noticeably weaker songs compared to some of his more recent releases over the years. And not once does it ever really feel like And Then You Pray For Me's track list manages to become particularly great in any way. And one would assume that an album with rock-solid cuts like Suicide and Selfridges would be fine at worst, but unfortunately, a lack of coming together from various elements throughout this record just make it so messy and questionable in terms of how this was put together. A lot of it just doesn't really make sense, and it feels like it's executed about as poorly as it could possibly be without being actually bad. On one side of things, you seem to almost be constantly faced with instrumentals that don't fit Westside Gunn and his style whatsoever, and those that do often don't feel particularly spectacular, both in the context of his discography and in the context of the experimental boom bap world at large. And on the other hand, you have a variety of features that range from pretty weak to genuinely great, but none of them have the influence and the striking qualities to really define a track as a standout must-hear song, or to really impact the album in a positive way that makes it better overall. The instrumentals are inconsistent, the features are inconsistent, and ironically enough, the only consistent thing on the record, Westside Gunn himself, is another quality that drags it down. The consistency of being consistent is something that negatively affects how he can be perceived throughout this record's track list. And Then You Pray For Me never feels like a true crash and burn. Again, even the weakest songs here aren't the worst thing in the world, and you would definitely be worse off with a variety of other albums from this year up to this point, but at the same time, it again just feels like nothing works here the way that it should, which is the exact opposite result that some of the past releases we've seen from Westside Gunn have had. Westside Gunn's opportunity to receive wider discussion beyond the music nerd underground circles that he once pretty much exclusively roamed in is one that he's definitely taken advantage of. His choice to shift into more popular trap-based sounds while still maintaining his roots in classic styles that have defined his career up to this point is one that I can kind of admire in the way. The guy obviously knows what he's doing. It's just that it feels on this record specifically, he doesn't know how to execute it. It's a mixture of new sounds for him that have been around in the mainstream for quite a while, and sounds that have been around for a while for Westside being introduced to the mainstream. And that's something that I can totally get behind, and it's something that has obviously created a lot of discourse around him, perhaps more than he's ever seen before. And from that angle exclusively, this is a highly successful record. That being said, whether the sacrifice of creative integrity or identity at that was worth it, that's up for each individual listener to decide, and I think I still kind of remain on the fence about it to this day. And Then You Pray For Me comes across like an album that wants to be great, but should be terrible, yet somehow manages to fail at being either just by managing to be both at the same time. It has huge lowlights, it has some pretty decent highlights, and it feels like there are a lot of good ideas here. I just wish that they were put together in some way that made more sense than random tracks that had instrumentals that didn't fit Westside style, tracks that felt like pretty average songs from him overall in the context of his back catalog, and a bunch of different features that range from good to great to horrible, yet at the same time don't really provide anything of major substance other than acting as a breath of fresh air away from a man that chooses to not change up his flow once throughout the entirety of a fairly long-ish record. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.